Section 11 of Fires and Firefighters by John Kenlon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Great Fires and How They Were Fought, Part 1, B. The writer must plead the indulgence of his readers if, in describing the great fire which destroyed the Equitable Building in New York, the narrative is related in the first person. Owing to the fact that he was so intimately associated with the events of that memorable occasion, to deal with it otherwise would be impossible, having due regard for the interests involved. At 5:55 on the morning of January 9th, 1912, the gong in my quarters struck 2:24, which indicated a second alarm from Station 24 at the corner of Nassau and Pine Streets. 2 minutes sufficed for me to cover the distance of about 1.5 miles between my quarters and the scene of the outbreak, which proved to be in the Equitable Life Assurance Building. This was an oldish structure, 8 stories in height and occupying the whole block, bounded on the north by Cedar Street, on the south by Pine Street, on the east by Nassau Street, and on the west by Broadway. The 3 first-mentioned thoroughfares were extremely narrow, and contained buildings of considerable height, though some of them were of antique construction and doubtful fire resistance. On entering from Pine Street, I ascended the main stairway to the 4th floor, whence, looking up, I could see that a considerable area of the stories above was involved. I immediately directed my first aide, Lieutenant Rankin, to send out a 3rd alarm, and then proceeded to the 5th floor, where I met Acting Deputy Chief Devaney, the officer in command previous to my arrival. Subordinate to him and directing the companies were Battalion Chiefs W.J. Walsh and George Kuss. One glance at the situation sufficed to impress me with the great battle ahead, and at once I ordered a 4th alarm with a special call for Water Tower No. 2. Water Tower No. 1, which had responded on the first alarm, was already raised on the Pine Street side of the building. I returned to the street with a full grasp of the conditions to be met. A 60-mile gale was blowing with the thermometer near zero. The direction of the wind was west-southwest, and I foresaw that it would drive the fire towards Nassau Street, where several old buildings, such as the Mutual Life and the Fourth National Bank, lay directly in its path. At this point, Nassau Street is only 47 feet wide, and should the flames have swept the buildings to the east, under existing weather conditions, an uncontrollable conflagration would have resulted. To protect this point, therefore, was the first maneuver, and the reason for acquiring an additional water tower. The second alarm assignment reported to me on my return to Pine Street and Broadway, and Acting Chief Kelly of the 3rd Battalion was immediately ordered to take command in Nassau Street. Engine companies were assigned to him and ordered to take their lines to the roof of the Fourth National Bank, to drive the fire back when it broke through the eastern wall of the building, as was plainly evident would soon occur. Captain Henry, supervising engineer, was directed to meet Water Tower No. 2 on its arrival, and have it placed in Nassau Street directly in line with the center of the Equitable, connecting it with the high-pressure hydrants in Maiden Lane, and to order the high-pressure pumps started at a pressure of 200 pounds. This was done to reinforce the lines on the roof of the Fourth National Bank. It may seem to the layman that the transmitting of the alarms, the assignment of companies, and the hundreds of orders consequent thereon would take an appreciable length of time. Yet, from the moment the gong struck in my room until all the arrangements had been perfected, exactly 6 minutes had elapsed. The actual plan of battle was evolved in less than 30 seconds after my arrival, and from that plan I never deviated. Knowing the construction of the building, with its 4 entrances and corridors leading therefrom to a great central staircase, it seemed doubtful from the first whether the blaze could be conquered, but the motto of the department under my command has ever been "fight to a finish," and hence we endeavored to outflank the fire by working from the staircase to windward, that is, toward Broadway on the Cedar Street side of the building. Similar tactics were employed towards Nassau Street to confine the fire to the Pine Street side, between the streams directed by the 12 companies in the interior and the heavy volume of water from the lines placed on the upper floors of the buildings on the south of Pine Street. Such was the first line of attack, and a second line was at once provided by the companies in Nassau Street and the tower stationed there. It is my deliberate opinion that the interior dispositions of the forces at my disposal would certainly have been sufficient, and have succeeded in quelling the fire, while the regrettable loss of life which followed would have been avoided, had it not been for the criminal weakness of the iron columns supporting so heavy a roof as that which surmounted the Equitable Building. The report of the New York Board of Underwriters on the subject is as follows. The columns appear to have been very defective, due to the shifting of the core during casting, making one side of the column very much thinner than the other. Their condition indicates beyond much doubt that the initial collapse in each case was due to the failure of one or more cast-iron columns. Thoroughly mindful of this circumstance, I ordered every person but the fireman from the premises. At the moment there were hundreds of cleaners and other people within its walls, absolutely ignorant of any danger, as indeed to the ordinary observer there were no untoward signs, and only trained experts could detect the presence of peril. It is a matter of considerable difficulty to persuade persons who fancy they have business to leave their occupations and vacate their offices under such circumstances, and some time elapsed before the police reported to me that all but the firemen had been ejected. Alas, there were several who never obeyed the summons, as consequent events were only too clearly to show. The fight now continued with increased persistence. I inspected Nassau and Cedar Streets, which, being to leeward, gave me some anxiety. Returning to the Pine Street corner of Broadway, I watched for a few moments the battle which was being brilliantly fought. Never did men struggle harder or with greater intelligence. Every order was promptly executed, but notwithstanding the stubborn attack from both within and without, I could see that the fire was slowly gaining. Until now, my reports from inside had been favorable, but judging from external conditions, I had grave doubts as to whether the officer in charge of those forces had correctly gauged the situation. It was this which determined me to make another inspection in order to satisfy myself. Accompanied by Lieutenant Rankin and firemen Henry and Blessing, I proceeded to the 4th, 5th, and 6th floors. Chief Walsh was in command on the 4th floor, and Chiefs Kuss and Devaney on those above. Chief Walsh was confident that he could drive the fire back and confine it to the Pine Street side. It must be emphasized that the conditions were good, very little smoke to weaken the men being observable, as it was driven eastward by the fierceness of the gale. Followed by my aides, I returned to Pine Street, where I found that the granite trimmings on the dormer windows of the upper floors were beginning to fly. This told me at once of the intense heat which must be surrounding the unprotected iron columns, of which mention has been made, and in consequence I ordered all companies to back down and out of the building. A most critical stage of the fire had now been reached. I knew well that within a few minutes of the companies inside the building shutting off their streams, the fire would gain complete mastery. Hence the problem was to get the men out and into position with the second line of attack, which had now become defensive. It is an axiom of warfare that an advance is easier to conduct than a retreat. With such a furious and destructive enemy as fire, the task is even more hazardous. Thus it was obvious that the companies on the upper floors should go first, while their comrades on the lower floors, in less exposed positions, held the flames in check and covered them with their streams. As soon as the latter were shut off, the fire burst through with increased fury, but was met and checked by the lines in the surrounding buildings, reinforced by the Nassau Street water tower. As a further precaution, the Pine Street tower was removed to the corner of the former street, ready to enfilade the fire and throw a complete water curtain across Nassau Street in front of the Fourth National Bank, should such a maneuver become necessary. The time was now 6:28 a.m., and I turned in a fifth alarm and ordered an additional £25 on the high-pressure system. I had now 23 engine companies, 6 hook and ladder companies, 2 water towers, and a force of 275 officers and men. Lieutenant Rankin was dispatched with the second order that the men in the Equitable should back down and get out with all speed, bringing their lines to the Nassau and Cedar Street side, which was the quarter by far the most dangerously exposed. All companies had now reached the main entrance except Engine Company 4 and a few men from Hook and Ladder 1, who, under the direction of Battalion Chief Walsh, were fighting obstinately and receding inch by inch. For the third time I sent an order, adding that it was imperative that he and his men should abandon their position, which had become untenable, and leave their line. Walsh received the message, but his sense of security, coupled with a desire to have one last bout with his foe, caused the delay which brought him death. A portion of the roof on the south side collapsed, forcing out part of the wall of the inner court and burying the steps down which the last men were hurrying. Before this catastrophe had occurred, the companies who had responded on the fifth alarm had been assigned positions in the buildings on the east and north, where they connected to the standpipes and threw powerful streams into the upper floors of the burning structure. Their efforts were successful, and at this point the flames were held in check. Captain Farley of Hook and Ladder 8 now reported to me that he and his men had removed Captain Bass and some members of Engine Company 4 and Hook and Ladder 1 from the collapsed part of the building. I then ordered a roll call and discovered that Battalion Chief Walsh was missing. A search party was instituted to rescue him, but failed in the attempt. I learned that as Chief Walsh was about to descend the stairs to the third floor, the unmistakable rumble of falling walls warned him of his danger. Had he remained where he was, he would have been unscathed, but he sprang over the rail and dashed towards a door on the left leading to Nassau Street. Could he have reached it, he would have cheated fate, as did 2 of his comrades, but he was buried in the wreckage within 2 feet of safety. Never have I known a man more enthusiastically devoted to his calling. It was the breath of his existence. Brave as a lion, and loving a fight for its own sake, he constantly studied to increase his technical skill. It was my knowledge of the man, of his bulldog grit and determination to conquer or die, that had caused me to be so insistent in my commands to him to leave his post of danger. His heroic spirit was shown in his last action. Aware of the peril, he called to Captain Bass of Engine Company 4, "Go at once, save yourself and your men," and he remained to add one more name to the roll of those who have died nobly in harness. It was now that the full force of the millions of gallons of water began to tell. The water tower in Nassau Street was sending forth a heavy stream through the 2-inch mast nozzle at a pressure of 120 pounds to the square inch, supplied by the high-pressure main in Maiden Lane. This was directed against the flames roaring through the Lawyers' Club on the 4th floor, while from the roof of the bank across Nassau Street, Acting Battalion Chief Kelly was performing admirable service. On the south, Battalion Chief Rush had availed himself of the standpipes in the buildings and was using our steamers in conjunction with the house pumps, thus being able to obtain a considerable pressure. The same plan was carried into effect in Cedar Street, and every exposed point was covered on all sides. I was congratulating myself that we were masters of the situation, when the fury of the gale increased. Gusts of wind attaining a velocity of 70 miles an hour swept across the open space formed by Trinity Graveyard at the southwest side of Broadway, and the mercury fell steadily and remorselessly. So intense became the cold that dripping walls turned to ice, and the streets were frozen lakes, while enormous volumes of water were turned to spray by the wind a few feet from the nozzle. Men were repeatedly thrown down in their efforts to cross the path of this hurricane, and I myself was taken from my feet, not once but 20 times, and dashed against the wall of the building where I stood. The Equitable now resembled a volcano in eruption. Great masses of granite from its walls were being tossed high in the air like thistledown and exploding 100 feet above our heads from the intense heat, their fragments falling in meteoric showers about us. A great section of the outer wall burst near the corner of Pine Street and Broadway, and a piece of stone weighing several tons fell near Mr. Robert Mainzer, with whom I had been speaking, missing him by only a few inches. I then closed that side of Pine Street, even forbidding firemen to pass along it. The intense cold seemed to give the flames a peculiar glow, while the high wind spread them fan-wise, flickering and beckoning over the ice-bound streets. There comes a time in a fire of this description which marks the beginning of the end. If outside exposures are properly protected, there can be no possibility of any increase in the conflagration, and it will be confined to the smallest possible space. Then one of two things will occur. Either the contents of the building will burn out, leaving no food for the flames, or it will fall. Should this latter contingency seem imminent, men must be kept at a safe distance from the walls, and judgment must be used to determine what is the limit of danger. Sometimes a wall will fall outwards at full length, as though on hinges, covering the width of a street. Then again it will collapse, break in the middle, and fall in a heap, like a house of cards. Needless to say, the first of these two conditions is the most dangerous in all respects, and must be guarded against at any hazard. In the event of a simple collapse, the fire has then passed the crisis, and as soon as this occurs, men can immediately be advanced to close range without special danger. The roof and floors of the Equitable building were heavy, and the intensity of the heat was so great that I feared it would expand and force the outer walls. Under such weather conditions as existed, and in the narrow streets, this would have been a serious matter, and every nerve was strained to the utmost to drive the fire back and to hold it in the center of the building. This attempt was crowned with success, due not only to the powerful apparatus at my disposal, but to the intelligent and in many cases brilliant operations of both officers and men. A fire chief can never tell what may happen from one minute to the next, and fires bring many surprises in their train, which call for quick action of mind and body on the part of the officer in command. This day was to prove no exception to the rule. Just as I felt that the fight was won, and was expecting an inward collapse of the floors on the Broadway side of the building, word was brought that 3 men were on the roof overlooking that street and calling piteously for help. After all my efforts to clear the building, it seemed impossible that anyone could have remained within its precincts. And yet these poor cleaners and porters had defied a command and had pitted their judgment against scientific knowledge, with the result that they had been driven up to the roof, where we could see them standing. To reach them on that spot, over 100 feet from the ground, when the possibility of a collapse had become imminent, was a task to test the nerves of the strongest and the bravest of men. That any attempt at rescue was fraught with great danger to all concerned, I had not the slightest doubt. But it is the duty of men on such occasions to brave death and even to defy it. All chances were against them. Momentarily I was expecting an avalanche of bricks, stone, and burning embers. The fierce gale swept strong men from their feet, and the spray from the nozzles froze on their faces till they could scarcely see. In spite of these conditions, the men responded to my call without hesitation. A hook and ladder truck was swung in on the northwest corner of Cedar Street, and in less than 1 minute the extension ladder had been raised. As I stood at its foot, I did not have a chance to ask for volunteers or to order any men to this terrible duty. On the instant, Lieutenant Rankin, Fireman Malloy, and Blessing sprang onto the rungs, taking scaling ladders with them. In the meantime, I could see that it would be a most difficult undertaking to scale the Equitable Building on account of the projecting cornice, and I therefore ordered Acting Chief Kelly and the officers and men of Hook and Ladder 1 to proceed to the 9th floor of the building on the north side of Cedar Street with the gun, roof rope, and lifeline. If the line could be shot true against such a gale, it might serve 2 purposes, for it would be ready for use by the men ascending the ladder, or, if this attempt failed, the captives could make the line fast to some projection and slide down to possible safety. The shot was aimed, and the line fell true. We could see the men in the act of hauling it across the space. When the expected happened, the great collapse came. With a cry of agony and despair, the unfortunates sprang out into the air, and as they plunged downward there came with them the roof and the upper floors. From my position, I at first thought the bodies were those of the brave fellows who had so nobly gone to the rescue, and though they struck the street a few feet from where I stood, and though fire, smoke, and debris were on all sides, for an instant I felt indifferent to my own fate. Then I realized that other lives and vast treasures were at stake, and that at this moment my life was of value to the city. Turning around, I walked slowly to the center of Broadway, and from this point I could see that the men who had ascended the ladder were alive. Blessing was on the ladder, Rankin had 1 foot on the ledge, and Malloy was standing on the highest ledge of the broken and badly bulging wall. Their efforts had been in vain, but heroism could have been put to no greater test. My relief was great when I saw them descend unhurt. And now horror succeeded horror with incredible rapidity. Scarcely had the unfortunate creatures who had jumped from the roof been removed from the street, when Fire Commissioner Johnson told me that he had been informed that there were men imprisoned in the vaults on the Broadway side. The windows of these vaults were protected by bars of iron 2 inches in thickness, and were inset at such close intervals that no human body could possibly pass between them. I soon found that this information was correct, for there, caught in a fiery prison, were 3 men, 2 living, pinned down by broken floor joists, and 1 dead, killed by a falling beam. With a raging fire behind them, a raging fire over them, heavy iron bars in front, and broken and tottering walls on every side, their predicament was a terrible one. "Save them! Save them!" was the cry from men who stood at a distance. But this seemed to be impossible. I directed 2 companies with sledges and other heavy tools to try and wrench out the bars. In addition, though scarcely to be mentioned in comparison with these precious lives, there were $1 billion worth of security in the vaults, and the fire threatened both with speedy destruction. Fully realizing the gravity of the conditions, and wishing to obtain a better view of the situation, I took the elevator to the 18th floor of the Trinity Building, directly across Broadway. When I reached the front window overlooking the Equitable, an awe-inspiring scene met my gaze. Beneath me lay a seething, boiling cauldron. The very earth seemed to vomit forth flames and send up from its depths mammoth tongues of fire. Parts of chairs, desks, and boards were being hurled like pebbles 500 feet into the air. Only the pen of Dante or the brush of Vereshchagin could do it justice. But the question for me to decide was whether the Broadway front would hold, or whether it would collapse, burying the entombed men and the companies trying to effect their rescue. After a careful survey, I determined that the walls would stand, but to ensure this, I ordered that a strong stream of water from the Trinity building be employed to reduce the expansion by forcing the fire back at this point. About this time, I resolved to transmit the borough call, feeling that additional aid was necessary properly to protect the vaults and the men imprisoned therein. It was also advisable to have a greater number of powerful streams on the leeward side of the fire, although up to this time I had been able to hold it in check. Now the time seemed to have arrived for an advance, and this my lines were unable to accomplish. All these conditions made the borough call a necessity, and the alarm 7724-3339 was transmitted. Translated into plain English, this meant that the companies assigned to respond on the third alarm to Box 39, Borough of Brooklyn, would proceed to Box 24, Borough of Manhattan. The Brooklyn companies arrived promptly, in charge of Deputy Chief Lally, and were assigned to positions, with the exception of the water tower, which was not needed and was sent back to quarters. 2 engines were connected to the Siamese inlet on the front of the Trinity building, and 2.5-inch lines of hose attached to the standpipe outlets on the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. These were all stretched to the 8th floor and connected in pairs by means of 2.5 to 3-inch Siamese. Then a length of 3-inch hose was connected to each of these, and in turn to a 3-inch Siamese. Leading from this was a length of 3-inch hose having a 1 3/8-inch nozzle. This provided a pressure of 130 pounds at the nozzle, with 260 pounds on each engine, and had less friction than if any other method had been employed. Now began the battle for life and treasure. Hacksaws were procured, and for almost an hour Engineer Lark, assisted by Rankin, Henry, and others, sawed at the bars, while great masses of stone fell from the upper stories around the workers. One great fragment rebounded and struck Lark in the back, almost paralyzing him. Rankin now took the hacksaw and cut through the remaining bars, so that ropes could be attached and the opening sufficiently enlarged to admit the passage of a body. One of the men was taken out, suffering from smoke, exposure, and shock. But the other cried, "For God's sake, don't leave me. My arm is fast." Upon examination, it was found that his arm was pinned across the back of the dead man by 2 iron beams, and for 15 minutes Henry and his comrades, using crowbars, pried and pulled, assisted by the man himself, before his release was effected. When free, he collapsed and was taken across Broadway, where he joined his companion under the care of Dr. H.M. Archer, who gave them every attention that humanity and science could suggest. By this time the fire was well under control on the north and east, and all danger of its crossing Cedar and Nassau streets had passed. I now called a boat tender and stretched 3.5-inch hose from the high-pressure hydrants to the Broadway front of the building. 3-inch lines were also taken from the water tower into the Cedar Street buildings opposite the vaults, and company lines were Siamesed in order that heavier streams could be forced against the gale, which still increased. This method was in operation on the roof of the clearing-house, where it was most effective. A peculiar phenomenon of this fire was that it worked steadily to windward against the furious gale. It seemed as though determined to destroy the enormous wealth contained in the vaults. All our forces were now concentrated to prevent such a catastrophe, and also to prevent the cremation of the lifeless companion of the two men we had rescued. Owing to the magnitude of our attack, the securities were untouched and unharmed. The walls, which were badly cracked and out of plumb, remained standing, and the corpse was not incinerated. Cautiously we now closed in, and the fight was over. There is one incident which I must mention, as it serves to show the hold sport maintains upon its votaries, even in moments of the greatest strain. Mr. August Belmont came to me and asked permission to go through his offices, which, facing the east, had to a large extent escaped the great damage experienced elsewhere. I personally went with him through the ruins of his once beautiful suite of business premises, now sadly spoiled by water and fire. He then explained to me that his chief fear was lest harm should have come to the records and pedigrees of his horses, which of course are famous not only in America but wherever racing is popular. I am happy to say that he found them intact, and with a smile he tucked them under his arm and bade me a cheery good day. Another fact which I take pride in recalling was that of the gallantry shown by Father Joseph P. Dineen, who, at the risk of his life, conveyed the sacrament to one of the men afterwards rescued from the vault. This at a moment when all the onlookers feared the worst, and no man would have been considered a coward for hesitating. Some idea of the magnitude of the operations can be gleaned from the following statistics. 85 officers and about 500 men operated 31 steam engines, 10 hook and ladder trucks, 2 water towers, and superintended the high-pressure service, while the water used in the attack amounted approximately to 12 million gallons. During the progress of the fire, all business in Wall Street was suspended, and anxiety reigned in 2 continents as to the fate of the $1 billion worth of securities in the strong rooms. It speaks volumes for the skill of the firefighters that not $1 worth of damage was done in that direction, and that when recovered the papers were not even discolored. The outstanding features of this remarkable fire were the tremendous value of the property at stake, the extraordinary climatic conditions, and the possibility of the spread of the flames, which would have caused a disaster unparalleled in the annals of history, so stupendous would have been the financial loss. In addition to this, the construction of the building concerned was something of a revelation to all thinking persons, for the weakness of the columns supporting the roof was so glaringly apparent even to the lay mind that those responsible for its erection must have been either hopelessly incompetent or criminally careless. Further, owing to the age of the structure and the idiosyncrasies of some of its tenants, it was a literal rabbit warren of private staircases ending in cul-de-sacs and narrow passages leading nowhere in particular. The only marvel, in fact, appears to have been that the loss of life was not greater, for it was only too easy for the firemen operating to lose their way in the intricacy of its mazes. I must not fail to compliment the police department on its excellent work in the keeping of the fire lines, this work being exceedingly difficult owing to the extreme exposure and extraordinary weather conditions prevailing. It is pleasant to record that financiers and others of wealth and prominence with offices adjacent sufficiently recognized the self-sacrificing devotion of the department in subscribing the sum of $185,000, the interest of which was to be used in perpetuity for the benefit of widows and orphans of firemen and policemen killed in the discharge of their duty. End of Section 11. Recording by Maria Casper.